subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
Hi guys, and welcome back. In the first half of this course, we've mainly been focusing on how we can create and run macros, and now it's time to move on to focusing more on the VBA code. And over the course of the next few lessons, we're going to fully understand the VBA Editor. I'm going to show you how you can edit macros and also how you can start to write your own from scratch. But first things first, let's make sure that we understand the VBA Editor. Now, we briefly jumped into this a bit earlier on in the course, and so you should remember that you can get to the VBA Editor either by clicking on the Developer ribbon and clicking on Visual Basic, or by pressing that useful keyboard shortcut Alt plus F11. And there we go, there is our VBA window. And you'll see in here it says VBA Project Protection Macros.xlsm, which is the workbook I have open just behind this window. And I have listed here both of the sheets in that workbook, so Invoice and Sheet 2. Then just under that, we have any modules that contain macros. So if I click on Module 1, that's basically what we're seeing in the coding window just here. So this is going to show basically all of the macro code I have contained in this workbook. And because I just have one macro, which was that macro we recorded to protect the sheet cells, that's the code that I'm seeing in the main code window in the middle. Now, just underneath the VBA project window, I have a properties window. Now, one of the things I can do down here is I can rename the modules. So module 1, module 2, module 3 isn't very self-explanatory, not particularly meaningful. So if I wanted to make these easier to find, I might decide to rename this and call this, let's say, protect_cells, something like that. And you can see that as soon as I do that, it renames the module in the Project Explorer, but it also names the window at the top here in the middle. So now it says Protect Cells as opposed to Module 1. So that's just an admin tip so you can keep on top of the different modules that you're creating. Now, if we wanted to create some kind of macro from scratch, so by that I mean typing it up directly in the VBA window as opposed to recording a macro and then editing, what we would need to do is jump up to the Insert menu. We've got a few different options in here, but if you want to create a brand new module, you would select Module. It opens up a new window. Now it's called this one Module 1 because I renamed my Module 1 essentially. If I'd left Protect Cells as Module 1, this new window would be called Module 2. And a bit later on in this course, we are actually going to write our own code from scratch. So just be aware that is your starting point, Insert, and then Module. Now I'm going to close that down for the time being because I want to focus on this immediate window at the bottom. If you remember, this is a little window that I opened up earlier on in the course, and if you don't see that, just to remind you, if you jump up to the View menu and turn on Immediate Window, alternatively you can press Ctrl+G, that's going to bring this little window up at the bottom. Now the immediate window does many things and can help you in many ways. Now, one of the things it can help you with is you can basically ask it questions and it will give you an answer. Now, if you want to ask it a question, you need to start with a question mark. So basically, I'm going to ask the immediate window to tell me how many worksheets I have in this workbook. So all I need to do is type in worksheets, dot, and you'll see that Excel's IntelliSense then kicks in and gives me a list of essentially arguments that I can add to this. So if I want to count the worksheets, what do you think I might apply from this little drop-down menu? Well, if you guessed count, then you would be right. So I can double-click to select, hit enter, and it's telling me that I have 2 worksheets in my workbook. Let's ask it another question. And for this, I'm actually going to, let's make these windows side by side. Like so, it makes things a little bit easier. I'm going to click on cell C6 in my worksheet, and then I'm going to ask the immediate window, question mark, active cell, so that's basically the cell that I'm currently clicked on, dot, and then I have my options. Now this time I want it to tell me what number formatting I have applied to the cell that I'm currently clicked on. So if I start to type number, you can see in the IntelliSense menu I have an option for number format. So let's double click and hit enter, and it basically tells me the number formatting applied. If I was to do this again for a different cell, so let's click on a text cell just here, and once again we're going to type in question mark, active cell, dot number format, and hit enter. It's telling me that I have general format applied to that cell. So pretty useful. What other types of questions could I ask? Well, maybe I want it to tell me what value I have in a specific cell. So let's click on this cell just here, C10. So let's type in question mark. I'm going to say range, open bracket. You can see I get my arguments underneath and it's telling me which cell. So let's say I want to find out what is in cell C10. Close my bracket, hit enter. It's telling me that I have the value 4000 in C10, and if I look at my worksheet, I can see that yes, that is true. So that is one use for the immediate window. There's lots of different questions that you can ask it to get an answer returned. Now, something else we can do with the immediate window is we can execute lines of code. So let me look at my worksheet, and I'm going to say that I now want to center the heading label item in the cell A5. Now, of course, I could do that from within Excel, but I could also execute it from the immediate window. So what I would say here would be selection. So it's basically going to reference the cell that I'm currently clicked on. Dot, and I'm going to say horizontal alignment, center across selection. Let's hit enter. And if you take a look in my spreadsheet, you can see that it's now aligned that heading to the center. I could do it for all of the headings. So if I select all of these and then just rerun my code, by hitting the enter key, it's now centered all of those headings. Now there are of course many other uses for the immediate window, but I just wanted you to start to get an idea of some of the kinds of things that you can do from here. And if you find the immediate window particularly interesting, then there's a whole heap of information about it online for some further reading. But for now, we're going to shift our focus back to our code. We're going to take a look at macros that we've already created. We're going to work our way through the code line by line so you can start to understand how to read through your code and also do things like identify errors and test out your code. So that's all in the next lesson. I will see you then. So before we start creating our own macros and our own code, it's a good idea to take a look at how macros actually build VBA code when you run them. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to run a macro on this worksheet, and we're going to keep the VBA window open as we do it so that you can see how the code is built. And then I'm going to show you how simple it is to make some minor modifications. So let's start out by taking a look at the data that we're using. So on this worksheet, I just have some UK software sale figures for 2019 and 2020. And I've got some subtotals applied to these figures. So you can see at the bottom of 2019, we have the total just here. And at the bottom, we have the 2020 total, followed by the grand total, which is basically just a calculation of the 2020 and 2019 figures. Now, this might be some kind of report that I need to send out to a client or maybe a different department. But it might be that once I've sent this out, they come back to me and say, you know what, actually, the layout or the font that you're using in this report isn't what we want. We want you to change the font, and we also want all of the headings and the subtotals to show in bold. So I'm going to record a macro, which basically does that, and I'm going to record it with the VBA Editor window open so you can see what happens. So let's press Alt F11 to bring up the VBA Editor, and what I'm going to do is just place these windows side by side so we can see what we're doing. So if we look at the VBA window for a moment, you can see at the top here in the project window, it says that we're in the Change Font worksheet, which we are. That's the name of my current workbook. And I'm currently clicked on sheet 1, which is the sales sheet. And one other interesting thing to note here is that I don't have a folder that says modules. If you remember, once you've recorded any macros, then you will have a modules folder and you can access your macro code from within that. But currently, because there are no macros in this spreadsheet, I don't have that folder. But you'll see that as soon as I start to record one, that folder is going to appear. So what I'm going to do with this worksheet is we're going to record a macro that basically changes all of the font to a different style and also bolds these headings, subtotals and total. So let's jump up to the Developer tab. And you'll see that because I now have my window smaller, it's only taking up half the screen, my groups of commands are now squished up. So if you take a look here, this one at the top is my macro recorder. Now for this, I'm going to turn off relative referencing. Let's click on Record Macro and give our macro a name. Now I'm going to call this Change Font, and I'm going to change this to a font called Segoe UI. So I'm going to add that to the title so I remember what this one is. I'm going to assign a shortcut key of Control Shift, let's do U this time, and I'm going to store it in this workbook. So let's click on OK. Now you can see I've got a yellow warning message pop up there straight away. That's simply because I don't have this saved as a macro-enabled workbook as yet. So we'll do that after we've recorded the macro, so don't worry too much about that yellow warning message just yet. The other thing to note is that we now have a modules folder, and that literally appeared as soon as I started recording. So let's run our macro. I'm going to select the entire worksheet by clicking on this cell in the top corner between A and 1. To select everything in the worksheet. We're going to go up to Home, into Font, and we're going to change our font from Calibri, and we're going to change this to Segoe UI. So that's going to be towards the end of the list, and it's this one here. And then I'm going to change the headings to bold. So let's click just here and select, up to Font and Bold. Let's scroll down and change our subtotals to bold. And then the final two here are also going to be bold. And let's just widen that column out, and then we're going to stop recording. Now, before we take a look at this macro code, I'm very quickly going to save this workbook as a macro-enabled file. And there we go, that warning message has now gone. So let's go over to our modules folder and click the plus to expand it, and you can see we now have module 1. So if I double click, that's going to open the VBA code for the macro that we've just recorded. So let's walk through this code and start to understand what we're looking at. Now with any macro, you'll always find that the code starts with sub and then the name of the macro, and also ends with sub as well. And sub stands for sub procedure. Now at this stage, you don't have to worry too much about what exactly that means. Just know that these kind of act as bookends to your code. So you'll always have sub and then the name, and then end sub at the bottom. What you see underneath at the top is some text that's in green, and it also has an apostrophe at the start. Now anything you see in this format, so has an apostrophe and is also in green, those are comments. So if you want to add some useful instructions into your macro, or leave a note or a comment for someone who's looking at this macro code, then you can do that simply by putting an apostrophe in front of what you want to say. And what it means is that when you run this macro, VBA isn't going to execute that line of code. So if I wanted to, I could add something up here, put an apostrophe in the front, and just say, this is for the sales team, something like that. And you can see as soon as I click away, that turns to green. So that's for any comments or any notes. We then have the start of our code. So let's start to get a feel of the format. And this code basically walks through all the steps that the macro took. So you can see here it says cells.select. So basically when I clicked to select all of the cells in the entire worksheet, that's the line of code that it produced. It then says selection.font name equals Segoe UI. And that's the font that I changed my worksheet to. Then what you'll see is we have quite a few lines of code related to different font properties. And you can see that the majority of these say false next to them, which means that they're not going to apply. So it says here dot strike through equals false, dot superscript equals false, so on and so forth. And this is what you'll find with a lot of macros that you record using the macro recorder. Instead of it just saying, okay, I'm going to change the font to Segoe UI, it basically goes through a whole bunch of other properties and says, nope, don't want to turn that one on, nope, don't want to turn that one on, so on and so forth. So effectively, all of this code, apart from where it changes the font selection to Segoe UI, isn't really needed. So we could effectively delete this out and the macro will still work. And that's exactly what we're going to do in a moment. And then the final part of this code is related to really the second kind of step that I took in the macro. So this is where I started to make all of the headings bold. So you can see it says range A6 to E6 dot select bold equals true. So it's looking at A6 across to E6 and it's changing it to bold. We then have active window, scroll down, so that's where I scroll down the page, and then range A19 to E19 select. So that's where we're talking about this row just here. We then have the same thing, we're changing it to bold, we're scrolling down and then selecting A32 to E33. So both of these rows down here, and we're changing it to bold. Bold equals true. And then finally, if you remember right at the end, I auto-fit column E to accommodate that newly expanded grand total. And that's the final line of code just here, column E, entire column auto-fit. So without really knowing a great deal about VBA code, I've fairly easily been able to follow the process that that macro has taken. So I'm going to click my mouse right at the end just here, and we're going to create another macro. I'm going to leave this window open so you can see it building. So maybe now I've sent this to a completely different department and they've said, we prefer a different style of font altogether. So let's create a new macro. I'm going to click on record and I'm going to call this change underscore font underscore Lato. Let's assign a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-L and click on OK. And you can see over in my code window, it's now put in the sub, the end sub, and some comments at the top. So I'm going to go through the same process. Let's select the entire worksheet. You can see the code building, cell select, up to home, into font, and now I'm going to select Lato font. As soon as I did that, a whole bunch of code was put into the code window. I'm now going to go to developer and click on Stop Macro. So now if we look at our code, we have basically a very similar thing. The only thing we don't have for this one is basically this section of code because we already have bold applied. So once again, we're selecting our cells, we're changing this to font Lato, and then the rest of this code isn't really needed. So I'm going to go in first of all, and I'm just going to comment out the lines of code that I don't want to run. So I only really want this first part to run up here, so everything from there down, I'm going to put an apostrophe in front of. So now what I want to do is I want to test out my macro to make sure that it still works now that I've commented out these lines of code. Now, if you want to test or run a macro, all you need to do is click at the top of the macro where you have the word sub, click just before it, and then if you look at your toolbar, you have a little play button just here. And this basically allows you to run sections of your code. So this is going to run this entire sub. So all of this code all the way down to end sub. So let's see if our macro still works. And there we go, it does. So I know that deleting these lines of code is not going to be a problem. So let's jump in and let's delete this out. And then what I can do, just to tidy this up a little bit, is I don't really need .name on a second line. I can just cut Control-X and paste this next to selection font. Now, something I also don't need in here now that I've deleted all of those properties is this statement that says with and then end with. So that's unnecessary as well. So I'm just going to delete that out. And let's run our code to make sure that it still works. And it does. So let's run the same process on our macro to change the font to Lato. So once again, I don't need most of this in here. I just need where it says selection font name equals Lato. So I'm going to select all of this and press delete. And I'm going to move this, and I'm just going to drag and drop it this time to the end and delete out the end with and also the with. Now, of course, you can tidy this up by removing some of these blank rows just by deleting them out, make it look a little bit neater. But let's now run this and see if it still works, which it does. Let's run our one at the top again just to double check. And yes, we are all looking good. So there we go. We've now seen how the macro recorder records code. We've read through our code to understand it. We've learned about sub and end as our bookmarks and how we can enter in comments so that certain lines of code don't run. And we've also seen how we can identify code that's unnecessary, remove it safely, and then test our macros by rerunning the sub procedure. In the next lesson, we're going to do a bit more on editing macros, so I'm going to jump over there now, and I look forward to you joining me. In the previous module, we saw how we can build a couple of macros. We've seen them in the VBA Editor, and I've just talked you through some of the code and how you can make minor modifications and then test out that code or rerun the sub procedure. So we're just going to follow up on that a little bit just so you can start to get a bit more of a feel about the types of things you can change. Now we're still working in the same workbook and the same macros. So we have our first macro at the top that changes the font to Segoe UI and also changes those headings and subtotals to bold. And then we have our macro at the bottom that changes the font to Lato. Now, one thing you'll notice is that at the end of each of these macros, we have this line of code, range A4 select. We have it there, and we also have it down here. So that is basically the last line of code that the macro executes prior to exiting the macro. And all that says is, okay, once you finish running the macro, where do we want the cursor to end up to be? Which cell do we want selected? Cell A4. And you will have noticed that when I run these macros, my cursor ends up in cell A4. So when we're thinking about making minor changes, this is something that's fairly simple to change. So if I decided that instead of cell A4, I wanted my cursor to end up in cell F1, that's a very simple thing that we can change in this code. So I'm going to click down here and I'm going to edit out A4 and replace it with F1. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Let's run our first macro and make sure that that still works. So we're going to click at the top and click on play. And there we go. My cursor is in cell F1. Let's click somewhere else before we run the second one. Let's click and press play. My macro executes and my cursor ends back up in cell F1. So far that is working perfectly. And you can probably see that based on that, if we wanted to make different range selections, so maybe I wanted to change something else to bold, I could just edit the cell references throughout the code. So reasonably straightforward to understand. So let's take a look at something slightly different. Maybe when I run my second macro down here, the change font Lato macro, maybe instead of just changing it to Lato font, I want it to change the headings, subtotals, grand totals to italic instead. So what I could do to make my life a lot easier is instead of rerunning the macro or writing out lots of lines of code, I can simply copy and paste what I have in the macro above and then modify it. Because if you take a look at this code, it says selection font bold equals true. So based on that logic, if I wanted this macro to change it to italics, all I would need to do would be to have the line of code selection font italic equals true. So let's see if that works. Now I'm going to copy this code down to here. I can see that I don't need this line, range F1, because otherwise it will be repeated. So I'm going to select everything above up until there. Control C to copy. I'm going to come down to here and let's just press enter and Control V to paste. So now what I can do is wherever I have the word bold, I'm just going to change that to italic. I'm going to double click, copy it, and we're going to replace bold just here as well. Paste. And we have it one more time just here. Paste. So now my lato macro says italic equals true. So let's see what happens. I'm going to run the first macro. Oh, we're already on that, so that's fine. And you can see that this macro has changed those headings to bold as it's directed to do. So now let's run our second macro and see what happens. Well, there we go. It has changed those headings to italic, but it's also kept them in bold. Now it's kept them in bold because I ran the macro on my spreadsheet that already had bold in the headings. So nothing in this code tells VBA to turn off bold. It just says make whatever's in this cell italic. So what about if I did want to turn off bold as well? What would I have to do here? Well, again, it's reasonably straightforward. What I could do is I could take this line of code, copy it, and change it to say selection font bold equals false. And that is essentially going to turn off bold. And that's what these true or false toggles do. They say, okay, turn this on, no, turn that off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to Control C and Control V to paste that line in. And we're going to change italic to bold, but we're going to say false. So what I should see in the heading here is I should see it still in italics, but not in bold. Now I'm going to do the same thing for these other items that have bold. So let's copy this line of code, go down to where we next have selection font equals italic, and paste that line in. And we have one more down here, and paste that line in. So now I'm going to run the first macro again, just to get it back to what it was previously. And now let's run our second macro. So remember, what we're watching for here is we want the titles to stay in italic, but we don't want bold on them. So let's click on play. And there we go. We have exactly what we're looking for, and our cursor is back in cell F1. So hopefully now you're kind of getting the idea as to how you can select a cell or different ranges of cells using VBA Code, and then how you can make some adjustments to things like the font style and its properties. So let's finish off this lesson just by adding in a couple of others that work along the same lines. So maybe when I run the lato macro, I also want it to change the background fill and the font color of this heading row. So we have all of the information that we need to do this. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and I'm going to put this in right at the end, just before it does the final selection of cell F1. So we want to start off by typing range, because we want to select a range first of all. So we're going to open our bracket, and our range selection, which we put in quote marks, is again going to be A6 to E6. So A6 to E6. Close quotes, close bracket. And we want to select that range. So dot select. And when it comes up in the IntelliSense menu, you can just press the tab key to have it auto-complete. So we've selected our range. So now what do we want it to do once it's selected that cell range? Dot, well, I want it to change the interior dot color index to 5, and 5 equals blue. Now you can easily look this information up online so that you understand which color index relates to actual colors, but for the time being just know that 5 equals blue. What do I want to do next? Well, then I also want to change the range A6 to E6, and I want to change the font color, again I can press tab to get that to autofill, to VB yellow. So now that we've added those two lines of code, let's rerun our macro and see if it works. So I'm going to click at the top and press play. And would you look at that, we now have a heading with a blue background and yellow font. So hopefully I've demonstrated there how simple it is to make some minor changes to your macro, and also how you can start to type in basic lines of code. And I will say that Google is a great help when you're learning VBA. If there's something that you want to do, in general, if I'm not sure what the code is, I just type into Google, change background color VBA, and you'll find the line of code that you need. And the more you start practicing typing your own code, the more methods and actions that you're going to learn. But for the time being, I think that's more than enough for now. I will see you in the next lesson. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to start to take a look at debugging. And all debugging really is working our way through our code and identifying errors. So you'll more than likely go through the debugging process for the first time when you run a macro and it goes a little bit wrong. It's a great way of identifying where exactly in your code the error lies so that you can then jump in there and just fix it up. So let's take a look at an example. Now currently I'm clicked on this worksheet at the bottom that's called Fixed, and this is essentially what I want my worksheet to look like once I've run my macro. So I have a table of data here, just some employee information. We have a date column that has all of the dates in it formatted with the short date format, and a salary column on the end. We also have a title at the top, and this is basically what I want my worksheet to look like once I finish running the macro. Now I've already created a macro that's going to do all of this for me. And this is a reasonably straightforward macro. So this worksheet here is what I want the worksheet to look like once the macro has run. But let's take a look at what it was like originally. So you can see I still have my data in the table, but I don't have any formatting applied to column F, and I also don't have my heading up here in cell A1. So what I've done is I've created a macro that when I run it, it should make my spreadsheet look like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to run that macro and see what happens. So let's jump up to the Developer tab, into Macros. There's my macro sitting there. It's called Format Column Currency Title. Let's run it and take a look. So I can see that I have a couple of issues here because this hasn't worked out quite as I was hoping. So if I take a look at my salary column, I can see that it has applied a currency symbol, but it's applied the wrong one. So clearly I've accidentally selected euros as opposed to dollars. And you can also see that I've accidentally clicked in a wrong cell when I've typed in my heading. So maybe I didn't realize I was clicked there when I was doing it. So now let's jump into the macro code and start taking a look at our debugging tools, which are going to help us work out what we need to change here. So I'm going to press Alt and F11 to pull up the VBA Editor. So let's do a couple of admin things here first of all. I'm in my debugging worksheet. There's my modules folder. There's my module 1, which is showing my macro. And I'm going to rename this module to make it easy to identify. So let's call it the same thing, format underscore col underscore currency underscore title, and hit enter. So let's take a look at our code. Now I'm going to work my way through this code, and this code isn't particularly long, and I will say that debugging tools are a lot more useful if you have a lot of code to work through. But let me show you how you can turn them on. Now there's a few different ways, and it depends what tools you find useful, because the debugging toolbar has quite a few utilities on it, but I tend to find that I mainly use one or two of them. So what you could do to turn the debugging toolbar on is right-click your mouse in a blank space up here on the toolbar, and you have a debug option. And it brings up a floating toolbar with all of your debugging tools, which you could then drag and drop and make part of your toolbar setup here. Now, I find that a bit much for what I want to do, and a lot of these are already on this toolbar. So what I prefer to do is right-click my mouse and go down to Customize, click on the Commands tab, and then select Debug from that categories list. That then shows you all of the different commands that fall under that debug category, and you can choose which ones you want to drag up to that toolbar. Now, the two that I use most often is Step Into and Compile Project, but I can see that I do already have Step Into on my toolbar, so I'm just going to grab Compile Project, drag and drop to place it on the toolbar. Let's click at the top of the macro, and I'm going to use my Step Into button. You can see there's a shortcut for that, which is F8. And basically this is just going to go line by line through my code, highlighting in the worksheet where that code is being applied. So this really helps you identify exactly where in your code things start to go wrong, making it a lot easier for you to fix any issues. So currently we just clicked on the title of the macro, so let's click Step Into again to move down. And the first one it goes to is Range F5 Select. Now you'll see in the spreadsheet it's currently still selecting cell A9 and A10. That's because you have to click again and then it executes the one before essentially. So now if you look at the spreadsheet, my cursor is clicked in cell F5. The next line of code it's going to execute is it's going to make a cell selection. And the reason why it says selection.end and then Excel down is because to select that whole range, I did Control-Shift down arrow shortcut. Once it's made the selection, it's going to change the number format to euros. So let's click again and you can see it execute that. So it's highlighting all of the cells, it's changed them to euros, and now it selects range A9, so we're over here now in column A, and then it says active cell and then global sales 2020, which is what I typed into that cell. It then selects cell A10 and types in microworld. It then selects both cells A9 and A10. It changes the font to 14. And the reason why it has 12 and 14 listed there in the code is because I used the increase font icon. So I clicked it twice. It was on 10, clicked it once to go up to 12, once to go up to 14. Hence why we have both of those clicks showing in here. And then finally, it makes that selection bold and then it ends the sub procedure. So if I carry on going back through, I'm now going to correct all of these errors and then we're going to rerun the macro. So let's carry on going through. The first error I want to fix is where it changes that salary to euros because I want to change it to currency format. So let's go through and it's this line of code that I want to deal with because this is where it makes a selection and then changes it to that euro format. Now this is where I might possibly use the immediate window before I actually change the code in the main window. So I know that I'm going to need selection dot number format equals. It's just a question of what needs to go within these quote marks. So I'm going to need the currency formatting and I want it formatted with 2 decimal places at the end. So this is where you have to kind of know a little bit more about Excel custom formatting in order to be able to write the correct format. So I want a $sign in here and then I want to have the number. So I need to put in a hash. I then want it to be comma in the middle there. 2 more hashes. I want a 0 on the end and then .00 and put that in quote marks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to test this out and see if it works. So let's hit enter and I can see that that works perfectly. So I know that I can now safely replace the code that's currently highlighted with this new piece of code. So I'm going to cut it from this immediate window, jump up to here, and then we're going to do a little bit of editing. So let's highlight all of this and delete. And we might as well delete the whole thing here because we've got the whole thing copied. So let's do Control V to paste that in and just delete that blank line in there. Okay, perfect. Let's now carry on stepping through our code. So the next thing we need to change is where we're typing in the word Global Sales 2020. And you can see just above it says range A9 select. So it's selected that cell and then it's typed in Global Sales. Now I don't want it in A9. I actually want this in A1. So I can quickly change that to A1. Let's carry on stepping through our code. It then goes to cell A10 to type in the word microworld. And I want that to be in A2. So again, I can very quickly just change that to A2. And then finally at the end here, it does range A9, A10. So it selects both words and it changes them to bold. So I need to change these cell references to the new ones, which is going to be A1 and A2. So now I should have been able to very quickly fix those small errors. So now I've been able to fix those errors. We're going to rerun the whole macro on our original data. So let's jump back to original and we're going to click at the top of the macro and we're going to press our little play button to run the sub procedure. And there you go. Would you look at that? Our salary column has changed to the correct format, and we now have those titles in the correct area. So those debugging tools, particularly that step into icon, just executes your code line by line so that if you are having an issue, you can identify exactly where it is and make the necessary changes. That's it for now. I will see you in the next lesson. Hi everyone and welcome back. It's now time to create our own module from scratch. And we're going to keep things fairly simple just until you get the hang of this. We're just going to create a macro or write some code that's going to insert a row at the top of this worksheet and then add column headings to this data. So I want one column that says first name, one that says last name, department, and then job title. And then I want to just format those headings with bold. So let's take a look at how we would do this if we were writing this from scratch in the VBA Editor. So I'm going to press Alt F11 to jump into the VBA Editor. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new module. Now I did show you this in one of the previous lessons, but let's just remind ourselves. We need to go up to the toolbar and click on Insert, and then from the drop down we're going to select Module. And you can now see here under the Modules folder it says Module 2, so let's give this a better name. So we're going to say Format Cells and hit Enter. So now we have a blank module, we need to first add some structure into it. Because if you remember, all of our macros started with that sub and the end sub, our bookends. So once again, we're going to jump up to Insert and we're going to say we want to insert a procedure. We need to give our procedure a name, so I'm going to call this Format Cells to keep it consistent, and then we can select the type of procedure that we want to insert. Now for us that's going to be sub, and it's going to be a public sub, but there are other types of procedures that you can add in here. For example, you can create your own functions in Excel. So we're all used to things like the sum function, if, countif, things like that. If there is something that you need to do in Excel, but there isn't a function available to do it, from here you could select function and then write your own function in VBA. And obviously that's much more of an advanced level than we're at now, but it's always good information to bear in mind as your knowledge of VBA progresses. So we're going to select sub and click on OK, and you can see as soon as I do that, it puts those bookends in for me. So let's press enter a few times to give ourselves a little bit more room, and we're going to start to compile our VBA code. So the first thing I want to execute here is basically I want to insert a new row at the top of this worksheet. So I'm going to type in rows, and I now need to specify a row index. So I now need to insert my row index, which needs to go in quote marks, and the first row that I select is row 1, and that's the format for typing that out. I then need to assign an action to this selection. So at the moment I'm selecting row 1, and what I want to do is I want to insert a row. So once I've got my row inserted at the top, what do I want to do? Well, I want to select the cell A1 and add the first heading into that new row. So I'm going to type in range, open my bracket, I'm going to put the cell reference inside quote marks, and our action here is value. And remember to press the tab key to select from the IntelliSense menu. And the value we want to enter into that cell equals first underscore name, which is what I want my heading to say. So just to recap, we've inserted a row at the top, we've selected the cell A1, and we've typed in the word first name. Now I'm basically going to do the same for the rest. So we're going to say range, B1 this time, and we're going to enter into that one last underscore name. Now of course, to make this a little bit quicker, I could copy and paste a couple of times because we have 4 columns, and then just modify these cell references and the names. So let's say C1, and I want C1 to say department, and then D1, and I want this one to say job title. Now once I have those headings in row 1, the final thing I want to do here is I want to basically make that entire row bold. So we're going to use rows again. And we're going to type the same thing. We're going to select row 1. And then we're going to say we want the font to be bold, and that needs to equal true. And then just to finish this off, we're going to say range. We're going to do A1 dot select, because that's where I want my cursor to end up. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all of the code. Now, of course, you could get a lot more complicated than this. I could add in some other formatting into here. So if I did want to go a little bit more complex, I could add something else into here. So maybe I want to have all of the font in that first row in a different color. So I could essentially kind of repeat what we have above, because we're just selecting that row at the top. But this time we want to say font.color equals, and then we can enter in the color that we want. Now I've just pasted in there a RGB code that I had saved off, because each color in the spectrum has its own code. And if you want to find out all of those, that is one for Google. You can go in there, you can find specific codes for specific colors and just copy and paste whichever one you want to use. So that is my macro, reasonably straightforward. So what we're going to do now is test this macro out. So let's click at the top. I'm going to click on our play button to run through this, and let's see if we get any errors. And you can see that we don't. That has worked perfectly. It's inserted that row, it's inserted those column headings, it's made them bold, and it's also changed the font color. So hopefully you can see there how even if you don't know a great deal about VBA code, it is quite simple to start out writing your own modules. And practicing this type of thing is going to give you a really good foundation for working your way up to writing more complex code, because there is so much to VBA and we're barely scratching the surface here.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get 4 free courses in Excel, QuickBooks, Microsoft Project, and Photoshop, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.